Shri Krishna Namaha, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Now, the continuation of Seek the Eternal by Shri A. Parthasarathi. The third aspect suggested for the physical body is the worship of Lord Murari. Worship is not confined to houses of gods or temples on particular days or time, but must be constantly practiced in the form of dedicated service to one and all, since every living creature is but a moving temple of Lord. To serve them is to serve the Lord. When an individual, thus trained at all levels of his personality, is spiritually enlightened, he becomes one with the Supreme Self. The Self is the core of human personality, acting as an axle around which the matter vestures and the entire outer phenomena revolve. It remains ever changeless and unaffected by the vicissitudes of the changing world. Shankara, in his poetic language, describes such a man of enlightenment as one who is not influenced by Lord Yama. Yama stands for the principle of change, and the implication is that the perfect man is not subservient to the principle, he is beyond it. Therefore, the Acharya appeals, do not trifle with the paltry things of the material world, but study the Gita regularly with a devoted heart, serve one and all, and come to realize the Supreme Self within. An individual is composed of the Supreme Self and matter. The Self is eternal, immaculate, and ever the same, while matter undergoes continuous changes. By identification with the changing aspect of in him, man submits himself to the persecutions of those changes, but when he attains himself with the Self, he becomes one with the changeless reality and remains unaffected by the variety of changes occurring in and around him. A change is noticeable only in the presence of a changeless entity. For instance, the movement of the earth is perceivable by virtue of the sun being in a fixed position. So also, a railway train appears to be moving only with respect to the immovable objects along its passage. Similarly, the awareness of changes occurring in the physical body, mind, and intellect establishes the existence of a changeless entity in the individual. This changeless entity around which all known changes occur is the Divine Self, which is man's real nature. The association with the changing aspects renders man as the limited ego who suffers the sorrows therefrom. The persecution of the changing world which the ego undergoes is called samsara. When, however, he detaches himself from them and begins to identify with the self, he becomes less affected by the environment and happenings in the world, until at last, when his identification with the God, the self, is complete, he reaches the state of God consciousness. Thereafter, the changing phenomena can no more disturb the serenity and bliss enjoyed in this state. He stands as firm as lighthouse amidst the ocean, emitting light for the guidance of all. The waves of change dash against him, but recede, leaving him unaffected. The Bhajagovindam describes the man identified with his material equipments as living in a state of samsara and going through an endless cycle of birth and death. The idea of birth and death has a wide implication in as much as it indicates the principles of change in general. For instance, the childhood is dead and youth is born, joy is dead and sorrow is born, and old idea is dead and a new idea is born, and so on. All of them indicate changes. He who lives at the level of his equipments is tossed back and forth by the continuous changes occurring in their realms and cries out to the Lord to help him out of the entanglements. But the wise one who transcends the equipments and establishes himself in the self enjoys the state of complete fulfillment and bliss. Thereafter, he lives on the barest minimum, wanting nothing and demanding nothing from the society or the world. The actions of such a man of perfection are described as being devoid of merit and demerit, merit, punya, and demerit, papa. accrue to a person when his actions are performed for the fulfillment of his own egocentric desires. The desires may be virtuous or wicked, but vasanas are formed in both the cases as long as they motivate his actions. When his actions are prompted by God desires, he acquires good vasanas, which are called punya, and when they are prompted by the bad desires, he acquires bad vasanas or papa. A man of perfection has no desires at all. His actions are not motivated by an egocentric and selfish interest, but are performed with selfless dedication to the higher altar. Hence, he gathers no vasanas and is said to be above both merit and demerit. A man of realization is also described as being similar to a child, a madman, and a ghost. In such comparisons, there are only one or two aspects of similarity between the two which need not be considered. In the case of child, it lives always in the present without having either regrets for the past or anxieties for the future, and so does a man of perfection. This explains how Lord Rama could give moksha, liberation, to the demon Ravana in spite of all his atrocious deeds, or how Christ could cry out to those who did him grave injustice as he was being nailed on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The example of a madman is taken to describe one who lives amongst mankind but gets lost in the world of his own to which the rest have no access. He talks of strange things and happenings, and his experiences are unknown to others. He sees what others see and something more. Similarly, a man of perfection lives like anyone else in the world, but at the same time transports himself to a realm of peace and bliss which is unknown, inconceivable, and inaccessible to others. The third example likens to the man of perfection to a ghost. The characteristic of a ghost is that it moves about fearlessly in lonely and dark places. So too, a man of realization revels in solitude and realms unknown to the mortals. Perfect in his freedom from all desires, he has no fear whatever in his bosom. These three examples help one to conceive the nature of a man who has reached the state of God consciousness. Therefore, the Acharya appeals, withdraw your identification from the changing phenomena of perceptions, emotions, and thoughts and discover the eternal, changeless reality within you. The question of the primal cause of existence of the phenomenal world baffles human intelligence. Man wonders who was his first ancestor. He struggles to decide the progenitor between the chicken and the egg, the tree and the seed, and infinitum. The Bhajagovindam directs such a man who is in quest of truth to an intimate enquiry of himself. Who am I? Where did I come from? Who is my mother? Who is my father? Following this lead, man begins to analyze his ancestry starting from his parents and tries to find out the origin and cause of his existence. While doing so, he reaches the state of intellectual exhaustion and postulates the existence of the first father as the progenitor of his race. Once this is accepted, the rest of the creation is intelligible. But the idea of the first father implies that he is an effect without a cause. In other words, the first father was one without a father, and this idea is not acceptable to any rational intellect. Such a man can never exist and is therefore unreal. If this be so, the entire progeny of non-existing father must also be an unreal and imaginary nothingness. The same reason will apply to all living creatures of the world, and none of them can stand the test of reality. This explains why Shankara declares the world to be essenceless and a mere dream. Vedanta, while declaring the world experience in the waking state of consciousness to be unreal from the standpoint of the supreme reality, compares it to the dream world. The waking or the dream world appears to be real only as long as one continues to experience it, but when one moves on the next plane of consciousness, the world of the earlier plane of consciousness loses its reality. Thus, the dreamer finds reality in the dream alone, while the world of the waking state is immaterial and essenceless for him. So too does the waker find reality in the waking world and considers the dream world as unreal. After they had analyzed these two states of consciousness and established a perfect analogy between them, the religious investigators declared that they found no reason whatsoever for accepting the waking world alone as real, and if one accepts the dream to be false, the waking state cannot claim a better status. The three states of consciousness which man experiences with the waking, the dream, and the deep sleep have only a relative reality, and that which is beyond these three states is the Supreme Self. It is considered as fourth plane of consciousness, which one reaches by transcendence of the other three planes of consciousness. Such transcendence is gained by careful subjective analysis of oneself, then through the non-identification with the first three planes, and finally through constant contemplation and meditation upon the self within. When the truth is described as something beyond the three states of consciousness, one gets an impression that it, being a total negation of all experiences in life, is a void or nullity. To dispel such misunderstanding, the truth has elaborately been described in the Shastras as bright and brilliant, omnipotent, omniscient, all-pervading, and so on. However, to reach that state of perfection, one has to remove one's identification with the world and thereby quieten the mind. As long as one identifies oneself with the world, the thoughts in the mind cause agitations, and an agitated mind veils the self. In a tranquil mind alone the self reveals itself. The self within is like the sun reflected in water, and the reflection becomes perceptible only when the water is motionless and peaceful. The agitations in the mind are caused by means of unintelligent attachment to things and beings in the world. Depending on the intensity of his attachment, man creates different grades of egocentric relationships such as my child, my relatives, my friend, and so on. The stronger these egocentric bondages, the greater are the agitations in his bosom. The Bhajagovindam therefore advises man to eliminate the false sense of relationship with the world by understanding and realizing that one divine principle which pulsates through all living creatures. No sooner man recognizes his common denominator in all beings, he drops his sense of differentiation and plurality, and the self within unfolds itself. But so long as the attention is focused on the variety of equipments through which the one self functions, he sees plurality and develops an attachment for them, even though he creates the pluralistic phenomena and entangles himself in them. The truth remains ever the same, unaffected by such creation. It is like electricity, which is always one homogeneous power, because of which numerous manifestations are created through a variety of electrical equipments. Therefore, the Acharya appeals, renounce your false egocentric relationship with the pluralistic world and seek the one eternal factor that binds them all together. Desire is the cause for breaking up the one homogeneous consciousness into the pluralistic experiences of the phenomenal world. When the cause is annihilated, the infinite variety of things and beings merge into the experience of one eternal truth. The desire in one's bosom has several modifications such as anger, greed, delusion, and so on. It may be found in an individual in its native form or in any one of its modifications. A desire for an object is generated when thoughts continuously flow towards it. The intensity of the desire depends upon the consistency and the rate of flow of thoughts. When the flow is intercepted by an extraneous object, the resulting deflection of thought currents produce anger, krodha. Anger, therefore, is a modification of desire. Where there is no desire, there is no anger. The means of controlling anger is to find out and quench its source, the desire which causes it. If, however, the existing desires are fulfilled, fresh appetites are created, with the result that one craves for more and develops greed, lobha. Here ends the part 5 of Seek the Eternal. I pray God for the best of all, for the wellness of all. Shri Krishna Arpanamastu. Illusion, moha, sets in. Shri Krishna Namaha, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Now, continuation of Seek the Eternal by Shri A. Parthasarathi. This is part 6. If, however, the existing desires are fulfilled, fresh appetites are created, with the result that one craves for more and develops greed, lobha. When this process is continued and more desires are entertained and fulfilled, one gets drunk with success and a sort of delusion, moha, sets in. In the epic Ramayana, the demon Ravana represents one such person who is deluded by wealth and power. To end the modifications of anger, greed, and delusion, the root cause of them all, viz., desire, must be annihilated. Once the cause is eliminated, the effects must disappear, just as a disease is cured when its germs are destroyed. The desire for the sense objects arises as a result of man's identification with his equipments and their functions. As long as man's identification dwells with his body and its perceptions, his mind and its emotions, and his intellect and its thoughts, he develops desires for the acquisition and enjoyment of the objects of the world. He is advised to withdraw his preoccupations with these equipments and the world and to direct his attention towards the Supreme Self within him. The Self is the life force which enables one to perceive, feel, and think. In life's activities, therefore, there are two aspects, namely, the divine principle, which is the power that supports them, and the actual perceptions, feelings, and thoughts. If one's attention is diverted from the latter and focused on the divine power, his desires for the external world wither away and he becomes gradually established in his supreme self. The Bhajagovindam prescribes practical ways and means by which man can gain his knowledge of the self. As a disciple for his physical body, he is directed to perform dedicated service to one and all without having an egocentric attachment or anxiety to enjoy the fruits thereof. The mind is also developed by maintaining constant association with good people and noble thoughts. A mind thus prepared is directed to meditate upon the Lord with single-pointed concentration. The three disciplines are prescribed for the three personalities in man, and he has to follow them conscientiously to progress on the path of evolution. Meditation, however, is the final gateway through which every sadhak must necessarily pass in order to reach the supreme abode of truth. Depending upon the extent to which these directions are followed, man sublimates his desires and thereby reduces his mental agitations. When he fails to discipline himself, the mind remains in a state of agitation, and such a state of mind is indicated in the Shastras as being in hell. But he who maintains progress of self-development begins to gain more and more mental equanimity. The state of relative happiness gained by a cessation of agitations in his mind is indicated as heaven. Hell and heaven are therefore not geographical places but are the states of one's mental condition. On completely annihilating the desires and agitations, one reaches the state of perfect tranquility, which is at once the state of absolute bliss. Hence, the Acharya appeals, do not create a hell of your own making, but release yourself from the bondage of desires and agitations and reach the state of eternal bliss. The world perceived by man is only a reflection of his vasanas, which are his own inherent tendencies. If the vasanas are noble, the world appears to be noble, and if they are vicious, the world too appears as vicious. Applying the same principle, when the vasanas are completely eradicated, the pluralistic phenomena of the world disappear and one experiences the non-dual homogeneous reality. This supreme reality lies within the reach of every man, but it is denied to him as long as he is extrovert and pursues the sense objects of the world. If, however, he disciplines himself and follows the direction indicated by the scriptures, he drops his vasanas and regains the transcendental experience. The Bhajagovindam again prescribes 3 codes of conduct to be practiced at the physical, mental, and intellectual levels of personality, and they are called the Bahiranga Sadhana. Their literal translation reads as follows: distribution of wealth to the needy. 2. Association with the good. 3. Meditation upon the Lord. In keeping with the tradition of our Shastras, the language used here is rather cryptic and needs elucidation. The first of the advices, namely the distribution of the wealth to the needy, is not to be construed as a mechanical and unintelligent parting of one's possessions and thereby bringing about penury and distress to oneself and one's dependents. Hinduism decrees the very idea of beggary, but on contrary, insists that man must produce before he consumes anything. Before man undertakes an act of charity, it is incumbent upon him to produce enough and to spare. For this, he ought to engage himself in rendering sincere and dedicated service. Having earned enough, he shares the extra wealth with the others who need it. For instance, when a man develops the capacity to produce and sets up a flourishing trade, he is able to support many other dependents who look up to him for help. One of the famous examples of acts of charity in the Shastras is the flow of the sacred Ganges. The constant flow of water fertilizes the fields. In fact, Ganges does not give up, but others help themselves out of its abundance. Similarly, the needy may draw the benefit out of the prosperity built by one's selfless and dedicated service. Another aspect of charity is that the beneficiary should deserve what he gets in charity. In other words, whatever one gives must emanate from one's intellectual discrimination rather than from one's emotional weakness. This idea is deftly suggested by the use of the word needy. An individual working in a spirit of dedication and service purifies his mind. A purified mind can be further developed by maintaining constant association with the good, which covers the second code of conduct. Association with the good would include the study and reflection upon scriptural truths, entertaining and mixing with noble emotions, and association with sacred people. A mind prepared in this manner becomes integrated and fit for higher contemplation and meditation. An undeveloped mind cannot soar high in meditative flights. The prepared mind is given a chosen name of the Lord to chant and the constant practice of chanting, the mind is rendered single pointed. In the last stage of meditation, when the single pointedness is retained for a period of time, the mind gets dissolved and the individual experiences supreme reality. One who has reached by the three disciplines the state of perfection is described in the text as chanting the Bhagavad Gita and the Sahasranama. Here again, the real import of the words is hidden behind their literal meaning. Singing the Lord's song is used in the sense of drawing out oneself the melody of life. In other words, a man of perfection is one who maintains a harmony between himself and the objects and the environment in the world. Also, he constantly perceives divinity everywhere since all his vasanas have been exhausted. The thousand, meaning innumerable, names and forms of the Lord, Sahasranama, appear to him in all objects and beings as one divine and auspicious truth. This state of absolute bliss is within the reach of one and all. Hence the Acharya appeals, leave the elusive objects of the world and serve, love, purify, meditate to realize the eternal truth. In the concluding portion of the text, Sri Shankaracharya summarizes the two main causes for man's extrovert nature and his preoccupations with the world as his passionate craving for acquisition and enjoyment of sense objects of the world. If these two could be avoided, one is well on the path of evolution to attain the glory of the infinite self. Man is confronted with two distinct and separate paths to follow in life, and they are called the path of good, Shreyas, and the path of pleasant, Preyas. These paths present a perpetual problem since at every moment of his life he is compelled to take to one of them. The path of the pleasant, as the name suggests, is pleasing and fascinating, and it enriches man to choose it in preference to the other. The path of the good, on the contrary, is unpleasant to start with and is based on religious precepts and injunctions and is generally repelled by the human mind. The characteristic of the path of the pleasant is that it provides immediate pleasure, but as one pursues the same, the pleasure diminishes and in the end leads to sorrow. The sense objects themselves have a magnetic power of attraction. Find the human mind, which longs for contact with them, falls a prey to their enchantment. Reveling in enjoyment of sense objects, man submits himself in his excessive indulgence until at last his body gives way and succumbs to disease, decay, and death. In contrast, the nature of the path of the good is painful in the beginning, but later on leads one to contentment and happiness. Religion, like a policeman, stands as the fork where the two paths branch forth and directs mankind to take on to the one path of the good. Man's inherent potentiality is unbounded and he has the faculty of pursuing the right path and reaching his highest state of bliss. He alone has the gift of discrimination with which to choose the path of higher or merely indulge in sense gratification. The general tendency of human beings, however, is to court with the sense objects and in the process get entangled in a web of sorrow and suffering. It is indeed deplorable that man should so foolishly deny himself the opportunity of making use of his faculty to gain for himself an everlasting happiness. Indulgence in sensual pleasures of the world leads to the development of passion for acquiring, possessing, and aggrandizing more and more material wealth. Such passion is a dangerous trend and man needs to avoid it by all means. A warning is therefore given that the wealth is calamitous and one should constantly reflect upon this idea to curb the passionate tendencies. The significance of this warning was gradually lost, and people believed that material wealth and prosperity were inherently dangerous and should be discarded. This is not true. Wealth and objects of the world are meant for mankind to enjoy, and they need not to be rejected, provided one knows the art of maintaining a proper and balanced relationship with them. If, however, a wrong relationship is developed, the same wealth, instead of providing comfort and happiness, becomes a source of trouble and sorrow. Similarly, one may consider electricity as calamitous. This does not imply that electricity as such should be discarded, but it only warns one against having wrong contact with it, as that would lead to disastrous results. Material wealth by itself does not provide happiness. On the contrary, it is associated with discontentment and sorrow, which can be seen on a closer analysis. The human relationship with wealth is subjected to three broad classifications, viz. The acquisition, the retention, and the discharge of wealth. In the first, one must put forth a lot of efforts and strain, and at no time is the acquirer free from trouble or anxiety in procuring it. Having acquired wealth, the problem of preservation arises. Now we will stop. This is part 6. We will see the remaining in part 7. I pray God for the best of all and for the wellness of all. Shri Krishna Arpanamastu. Shri Krishna Namaha, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. The continuation of Seek the Eternal by Shri A. Parthasarathi. This is part 7 and the last part. Material wealth by itself does not provide happiness. On the contrary, it is associated with discontentment and sorrow, which can be seen on a closer analysis. The human relationship with wealth is subjected to three broad classifications, viz. The acquisition, the retention, and the discharge of wealth. In the first, one must put forth a lot of effort and strain, and at no time is the acquirer free from trouble or anxiety in procuring it. Having acquired wealth, the problem of preservation arises. The possessor of wealth alone can appreciate the amount of worry and anxiety that he has to go through for merely holding on to what he has earned. Lastly, the parting of wealth is again painful. No one feels it a pleasure to give away his prized possessions, and yet every human being craves for more and more wealth and possession. When his passion gets fulfilled, he develops other psychological traits like greed, arrogance, pride, jealousy, and fear. A man who reaches the highest prosperity is afraid of losing it and is described as fearing his own son, lest the latter should wrench it away from him. Wealth is no doubt necessary for existence in life, but it must be supported by an appropriate mental attitude towards it. Religion never advocates rejection of wealth but only advises man to renounce his unintelligent yearning for it. This idea is well brought out in the symbol of Lord Ganesha sitting in the midst of plenty of prosperity but maintaining strict self-control and austerity and not being overpowered by them. Hence, the Acharya appeals, reject the path of the pleasant and take to the path of good and reach the abode of supreme bliss. The passion for wealth and enjoyment is the cause for entanglement in the limitations of the pluralistic world. The first step towards redemption is to disengage oneself from the clutches of this passion. Having advised this, The Bhajagovindam again provides a path to the divine goal of human existence, and this comprises the 5 stages of spiritual practices called Antaranga Sadhana. The first practice recommended is pranayama, which envisages a control over different manifestations of life in a human being. It is not to be construed as mere breath control or swasayama as it is generally believed. The control over life's activities can be brought about by disciplines such as selfless service, devotion to the Lord, and a study of the scriptures. A lack of spiritual discipline in an individual drives his mind to the field of sense objects so that it is never available for application to the higher. But as he develops a control over the senses by the practice of pranayama, he learns the art of calling back his mind whenever it chances to wander in the sensual fields. Such conscious withdrawal of mind from its worldly entanglement is called pratyahara, which is the second stage of spiritual practice. As long as the mind is extrovert and is employed in sense activities, the individual cannot pursue the spiritual path. One has to pull back the mind and make it available for higher pursuits, and this is achieved by pratyahara. A mind which rushes to the world of objects is full of desires and agitations. Such a state of mind is not conducive for quiet reflection upon the higher truth. Withdrawal of the mind from the external world quietens the agitations and prepares the ground for contemplation. In such a mental atmosphere, the intellect is made to distinguish between the ephemeral objects of the world and the eternal principle of life. In other words, one is trained to contemplate upon and discriminate the real from the unreal, the changeless from the changing, the imperishable from the perishable, and so on. The development of such discrimination defines the third phase of spiritual practices. The above 3 disciplines cater to the physical, mental, and intellectual personalities, and together they render the human mind integrated and qualify it for japa. Japa is the training imparted to the mind to concentrate upon a single line of thought to the exclusion of all other thoughts. By constant and regular practice of japa, which forms the fourth aspect of the spiritual program, the individual gains concentration or dharana. The last stage is dhyana or meditation, where the seeker succeeds in keeping the mind in single pointed concentration upon the Lord. When such concentration is prolonged, man enters the state of thoughtlessness or samadhi, which is the divine goal of human evolution. The 5 phases of development help an individual to grow from egocentric existence into the supreme state of God consciousness, but like any evolution in nature, it takes its time for its growth and fulfillment. The pilgrim is advised to bear this in mind and develop a lot of patience while he puts forth his efforts consciously. The results of these practices are intangible, and it is difficult to assess the spiritual growth of a person. One has to patiently wait before the first signs of development appear. Many an impatient seeker has discarded spiritual practices not knowing this truth. The warning given in Bhajagovindam is therefore most useful for those who are earnestly seeking the self-development. In the concluding stanza of the text, there is an appeal to all seekers to get over their stress and strain in life and experience the divine bliss within by maintaining a deep devotion to the Guru. Devotion is emphasized because the intellect alone cannot carry one to the supreme truth. Intellectual discrimination has to be properly blended with the spirit of surrender and worship, and this combination gives man the intuitive knowledge of the self. The supreme self dwells in the core of one's personality. It is not something which has to be gained from somewhere, but an unfoldment of one's divine nature which lies veiled by one's vasanas. Acharya Shankara concludes his divine song with his kind blessings. May you all be liberated from the worldly entanglements and experience the Lord who dwells in your hearts. Here ends Seek the Eternal by Shri A. Parthasarathi. Now we will try to sing some of the stanzas of Bhaja Govindam in Kannada. Govindananene, 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 Mudamana, Kala Samipise, Bandare Ninnanu, Kala Samipise, Bandare Ninnanu, Lakshisalaradu, ಪ್ರಾಪಂಚಿಕವು ರಕ್ಷಿಸಲಾರದು ಪ್ರಾಪಂಚಿಕವು ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಧನ ಸಂಚಯದ ಹವ ಬಿಡು ಮೂಡ ನಿಜವೇನೆಂಬುದ ಚಿಂತಿಸು ಮನದೇ ಏನನು ಗಳಿಸಿದೆ ಅದರಿಂದಲೇನೆ ಪಡೆದುಕೋ ನೆಮ್ಮದಿ ಸಂತೋಷವನು ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ನಾರಿಯ ಗುರುಕುಚ ನಾಭಿದೇಶವ ನೋಡುತ್ತ ಮೋಹಿತನಾಗದಿರೋ ಅವು ಬರಿ ಮಾಂಸವಿಕಾರಗಳೆಂಬುದ ಮತ್ತು ಮತ್ತು ನೆನೆಯುತ್ತಿರೋ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ನಳಿನಿ ದಳಗತ ಜಲವತಿ ಚಂಚಲ ನಶ್ವರ ಜೀವನವದರಂತೆ ಲೋಕದೊಳೆಲ್ಲೆಡೆ ತುಂಬಿವೆ ತುಳುಕಿವೆ ರೋಗ ರುಜಿನ ಮದ ಶೋಕಗಳು ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಧನ ಸಂಗ್ರಹ ಬಲ ನಿನಗಿರುವನಕ ನಿನ್ನನು ಮೂತಿರುವುದು ಪರಿವಾರ ಮೂಪಾವರಿಸಿದ ದುರ್ಬಲ ದೇಹದ ನಿನ್ನನು ಕಂಡರೆ ಸರಿವರು ದೂರ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ನಿನ್ನೆ ದೇಹದೊಳ್ ಉಸಿರುವಂದೋ ಕೇಳುವರೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಮನೆ ವಾರ್ತೆಯನು ನೀನು ಸಿರಡಗಿದ ಶವವಾದಂದು ಮಡದಿಗೂ ಬಲಿ ಭಯ ಬಳಿ ಬರಲು ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಬಾಲ್ಯಾವಸ್ಥೆಯೋಳಾಡುವ ಚಪಲ ಯೌವನದಲ್ಲಿ ಯುವತಿಯ ಚಪಲ ವೃದ್ಧಾಪ್ಯದೋಳು ಚಿಂತೆಯ ಸಂತೆ ಇರದೋ ಬನಿಗೋ ದೇವರ ಚಿಂತೆ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಸತಿ ನಿನಗಾರು ಸುತ ನಿನಗಾರು ಅತಿ ವೈಚಿತ್ರ್ಯದ ಸಂಸಾರವಿದೋ ದಿಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದೆ ಎಂಬುದ ಚಿಂತಿಸು ಸೋದರನೇ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಸತ್ಸಂಗತ್ವದೆ ನಿಸ್ಸಂಗತ್ವವು ನಿಸ್ಸಂಗತ್ವದಿ ನಿರ್ಮೋಹತ್ವವು ನಿರ್ಮೋಹತ್ವದಿ ನಿಶ್ಚಲತತ್ವವು ನಿಶ್ಚಲತತ್ವದಿ ಜೀವದ ಮುಕ್ತಿ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಮುಪ್ಪಡರಿದ ಬಳಿಕೆಲ್ಲಿಯ ಕಾಮ ಎಲ್ಲಿಯ ಕೆರೆ ನೀರಿಂಗಿದ ಮೇಲೆ ಹಣ ಮುಗಿದಂದಲ್ಲಿಯ ಪರಿವಾರ ತತ್ವಜ್ಞಾನಿಗೆಲ್ಲಿಯ ಸಂಸಾರ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಅಂಗಗಳೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಶಕ್ತಿವಿಹೀನವು ಒಂದು ಹಲ್ಲು ಬಾಯೊಳಗಿಲ್ಲ ದಂಡದ ಬಲದಿ ನಡೆಯುವರದನು ಆಶಾಪಿಂಡವ ಬಿಡಲಾರ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಯೋಗದೊಳಿದ್ದೋ ಭೋಗದೊಳಿದ್ದೋ ಸಂಗದೊಳಿದ್ದೋ ನಿಸ್ಸಂಗದೋಳೋ ಬ್ರಹ್ಮಾನಂದವ ಪಡೆವಾಸಕ್ತನೆ ಸುಖಿಯೋ ಸುಖಿಯವ ನಿತ್ಯ ಸುಖಿ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಹುಟ್ಟುತ್ತ ಮತ್ತೆ ಸಾಯುತ್ತ ಮತ್ತೆ ಜನನಿಯ ಜಠರದಿ ಶಯನವು ಮತ್ತೆ ದೋಸ್ತರವೇ ಸಂಸಾರ ಮುರಾರೇ ಅಪಾರ ಕೃಪೆಯಿಂದೆನ್ನನು ಸಲಹು ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ ಬೀದಿಯೊಳಾಯ್ದ ಚಿಂದಿಯ ನೋಟು ಪುಣ್ಯ ಪುಣ್ಯ ತೀತನು ಎನಿಸೆ ಯೋಗಾಸಕ್ತಿಯೋಳಿರುವನೇ ಯೋಗಿ ಮಗು ಮರುಳನು ಎಂಬಂತೆ ಗೋವಿಂದನನೆ 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 ಮೂಢಮನ. Here we will conclude to the Seek the Eternal and Shankaracharya's Bhajagovindam. I pray God for all the best of all, for all the wellness of all. Shri Krishna Arpanamastu. Jagratah 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 Mata nasti Pita nasti Nasti bandhu sahodarah Artam nasti Griham nasti Tasmat jagrata jagrata Janma dukkam jara dukkam Jaya dukkha punaha punaha Samsara sagaram dukkam Tasmat jagrata jagrata Tasmat jagrata ಜಾಗ್ರತಃ. ನಮ್ಮ ಆತ್ಮೋದ್ಧಾರಕ್ಕೆ ತಾಯಿ, ತಂದೆ, ಬಂಧುಗಳು, ಸಹೋದರರು, ದುಡ್ಡು, ಮನೆ ಇದು ಯಾವುದೂ ಉಪಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬರುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಹುಟ್ಟುವಾಗ ದುಃಖ, ಮುಪ್ಪು ದುಃಖ, ಹೆಂಡತಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ದುಃಖ, ಪುನಃ ಪುನಃ ದುಃಖ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಸಂಸಾರ ಸಾಗರವೇ ದುಃಖಮಯ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆಯಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಕಾಮಃ ಕ್ರೋಧಃ ಲೋಭಶ್ಚ ದೇಹೇ ತಿಷ್ಠಂತಿ ತಸ್ಕರಾಃ ಜ್ಞಾನರತ್ನಾಪಹಾರಾಯ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ಆಶಯ ಬದ್ಯತೆ ಲೋಕ ಕರ್ಮಣ ಬಹುಚಿಂತಯ ಆಯುಕ್ಷೀಣಂ ನ ಜಾನಾತಿ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ಕಾಮ ಕ್ರೋಧಗಳೆಂಬ ಕಳ್ಳರು ನಮ್ಮೊಳಗೆ ಇರುವ ಜ್ಞಾನರತ್ನವನ್ನು ಅಪಹರಿಸುವುದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಹೊಂಚು ಹಾಕುತ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆಯಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಜ್ಞಾನ ಎಂಬ ಪವಿತ್ರ ರತ್ನವನ್ನು ಕದಿಯುವ ಕಳ್ಳರು ನಮ್ಮೊಳಗೆ ಕಾಮ, ಕ್ರೋಧ, ಲೋಭ ರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಡಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕಾಮ ಈಡೇರಿದಾಗ ಲೋಭ, ಅದು ಎಣಿಸಿದ ಮಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿರದಾಗ ಕ್ರೋಧ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಎಚ್ಚರ ಎಚ್ಚರ ಎಚ್ಚರ. ಆಸೆಯಿಂದ, ಕರ್ಮದಿಂದ, ಚಿಂತೆಯಿಂದ ಮನುಷ್ಯನು ಬದ್ಧನಾಗಿರುತ್ತಾನೆ. ಆಯುಷ್ಯವು ಸವೆಯುತ್ತಿದ್ದರೂ ಅದನ್ನು ಗಮನಿಸುತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಮನುಷ್ಯನ ಸಕಲ ದುಃಖಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾರಣ ರಾಗದ್ವೇಷಗಳು. ಈ ದುರಾಸೆಯೇ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಲೋಕಬಂಧನದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನಾ ರೀತಿಯ ಚಿಂತಾಜನಕ ಕರ್ಮಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ತೊಡಗಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ದಿನೇ ದಿನೇ ಆಯುಸ್ಸು ಕ್ಷೀಣವಾಗಿ ನಾವು ಮೃತ್ಯುವಿಗೆ ಹತ್ತಿರವಾದದ್ದು ತಿಳಿಯಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಹು ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಎಚ್ಚರ ಎಚ್ಚರ ಎಚ್ಚರ. ಸಂಪದಃ ಸ್ವಪ್ನ ಸಂಕಾಶ ಯೌವನಂ ಕುಸುಮೋಪಮಂ ವಿದ್ಯುಚ್ಚಂಚಲಮಾಯುಷ್ಯಂ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ಕ್ಷಣಂ ವಿತ್ತಂ ಕ್ಷಣಂ ಚಿತ್ತಂ ಕ್ಷಣಂ ಜೀವಿತಮಾವಯೋ ಯಮಸ್ಯ ಕರುಣಾ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಸ್ವಪ್ನ ಸಮಾನ. ಯೌವನವು ಹೂವಿನಂತೆ ಬಾಡುತ್ತಿದೆ, ಆಯುಷ್ಯವಂತೂ ಮಿಂಚಿನಂತೆ ಹಾರಿ ಹೋಗುತ್ತಿದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ವಿತ್ತ, ಚಿತ್ತ, ಜೀವಿತ ಎಲ್ಲವೂ ಕ್ಷಣಿಕವೇ. ಯಮನಿಗೆ ದಯೆ ಎಂಬುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ದರಿಂದ ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆಯಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆ. ಯಾವತ್ ಕಾಲಂ ಭವೇತ್ ಕರ್ಮ ತಾವತ್ ತಿಷ್ಠಂತಿ ಜಂತವಃ ತಸ್ಮಿನ್ ಕ್ಷಣೇ ವಿನಶ್ಯಂತೆ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ. ಮನುಷ್ಯ ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ತನ್ನನ್ನು ವಿವಿಧ ಕರ್ಮಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ತೊಡಗಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಾನೆ. ಆವಾಗ ಯಾವಾಗ ಕಾಲ ಬರ್ತದೋ ಆವಾಗ ನಾವು ಹೊರಡಲೇಬೇಕಾಗ್ತದೆ. ಈ ಎಚ್ಚರ ನಮಗೆ ಸದಾ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಯಾವ ಹೊತ್ತಿಗೂ ಪ್ರತಿ ಕ್ಷಣ ಕ್ಷಣಕ್ಕೂ ಭಗವಂತನ ಚಿಂತನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ತೊಡಗಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ನಮ್ಮ ಆತ್ಮೋದ್ಧಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾದಂತಹ ಈ ದೇಹವನ್ನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಭಗವಂತ. ಆ ದೇಹವನ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲೂ ಸಂರಕ್ಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಸರಿಯಾದ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಉಪಯೋಗ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಈ ದೇಹ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವ ನಾವೆಯ ಮೂಲಕ ಭಗವಂತನ ಆಚೆ ದಡವನ್ನು ನಾವು ಸೇರಲೇಬೇಕು. ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಎಚ್ಚರವಾಗಿರಬೇಕು ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ. ಋಣಾನುಬಂಧರೂಪೇಣ ಪಶುಪತ್ನಿ ಸುಖಾದಯ ಋಣಕ್ಷಯೇ ಕ್ಷಯಂ ಯಾಂತೆ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ. ಋಣಾನುಬಂಧ ರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ಪಶು, ಪತ್ನಿ, ಮನೆ, ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಗ್ತವೆ. ಆ ಋಣ ತೀರಿದ ಕೂಡಲೇ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಮತ್ತ ಹೋಗಬೇಕಾಗ್ತದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಈ ಯೋಚನೆಯನ್ನು ಸದಾ ಮನಸ್ಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡಿರಬೇಕು. ಪಕ್ವಾನಿ ತರುಪರ್ಣಾನಿ ಪತಂತಿ ಕ್ರಮಶೋ ಯಥಾ ತಥೈವ ಜಂತವಃ ಕಾಲೇ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ. ಹಣ್ಣುಗಳು ಬೆಳೆದಾಗ ಮರದಿಂದ ಕೆಳಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಬೀಳುತ್ತವೆಯೋ ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಜಂತುಗಳು ಅಂದರೆ ಜೀವಿಗಳು ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ ತಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಒಗ್ಗಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಅದು ಹೇಗೆ ನಡೀತದೋ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಒಪ್ಪಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕು. ಆ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಭಗವಂತನಿಗೆ ಸರಿಯಾದ ಬದುಕನ್ನು ಬದುಕಬೇಕು. ಈ ಎಚ್ಚರ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಸದಾ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಏಕವೃಕ್ಷ ಸಮಾರೂಢ ನಾನಾ ಜಾತಿ ವಿಹಂಗಮ ಪ್ರಭಾತೆ ವಿದಿಶೋ ಯಾಂತಿ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನಾ. ಒಂದೇ ವೃಕ್ಷದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನಾ ವಿಧದ ನಾನಾ ಜಾತಿಯ ಪಕ್ಷಿಗಳು ವಾಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತವೆ. ಬೆಳಗಾಯಿತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರೆ ತಮ್ಮ ಪಾಡಿಗೆ ಹೊರಟು ಹೋಗ್ತವೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಯಾಕೆ ದುಃಖಿಸಬೇಕು? ಇದಂ ಕಾಷ್ಟಂ ನದ್ಯಾಂ ವಹತಿ ಸಂಗತಃ ಸಂಯೋಗಾಶ್ಚ ವಿಯೋಗಶ್ಚ ಪರಿದೇವನ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನ ಕಾ ತತ್ರ ಪರಿದೇವನ. ಎರಡು ಕಟ್ಟಿಗೆಯ ತುಂಡುಗಳು ನದಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಟ್ಟು ಸೇರಿಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತವೆ. ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ದೂರ ಹೋಗುವಾಗ ಒಟ್ಟಾಗ್ತವೆ, ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ದೂರ ಹೋಗುವಾಗ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತವೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಒಟ್ಟಾಗುವುದು, ವಿಯೋಗ ಆಗುವುದು, ಇದು ಎರಡು ಕೂಡ ಸಹಜವಾದ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಗಳು. ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ಒಪ್ಪಿಕೊಳ್ಳಲೇಬೇಕು. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ದುಃಖಪಟ್ಟು ಏನು ಉಪಯೋಗ? ಮಾತಾ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ಪಿತಾ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ಬಂಧು ಸಹೋದರ ಅರ್ಥಂ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ಗೃಹಂ ನಾಸ್ತಿ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ತಾಯಿ, ತಂದೆ, ಬಂಧು, ಸಹೋದರ, ಹಣ, ಮನೆ ಯಾವುದೂ ಉಪಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬರುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆತ್ಮೋದ್ಧಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರುವುದು ಭಗವಂತನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಚಲವಾದ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾದಂತಹ ಜ್ಞಾನ, ಇಷ್ಟೇ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಹಳ ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು, ತುಂಬ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆಯಿಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಜನ್ಮ ದುಃಖಂ ಜರಾ ದುಃಖಂ ಜಾಯಾ ದುಃಖ ಪುನಃ ಪುನಃ ಸಂಸಾರ ಸಾಗರಂ ದುಃಖಂ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ತಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಜಾಗ್ರತ ಜಾಗ್ರತ. ಜನ್ಮವೂ ದುಃಖವೇ, ಮುಪ್ಪು ದುಃಖವೇ, ಪತ್ನಿಯೂ ದುಃಖವೇ. ಇಷ್ಟೇ ಯಾಕೆ, ಸಂಸಾರ ಸಾಗರವೇ ದುಃಖಮಯ. ನೆನಪಿರಲಿ, ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆ. ಈ ರೀತಿ ನಾವು ಎಚ್ಚರದಿಂದಿದ್ದು ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಕಾಮಕ್ರೋಧಾದಿ ಷಡ್ವೈರಿಗಳನ್ನು ಹೊಡೆದೋಡಿಸಿ ಆ ಸ್ಥಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಭಕ್ತಿ ಜ್ಞಾನ ವೈರಾಗ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ತುಂಬಿಕೊಂಡು ಭಗವಂತನ ಪಾದದೆಡೆಗೆ ಪ್ರಯಾಣ ಬೆಳೆಸೋಣ. ಭಗವಂತನೆಡೆಯ ನಮ್ಮ ಪ್ರಯಾಣ ಈಗಿಂದೀಗಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲಿಯೇ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾಯುವಷ್ಟು ವ್ಯವಧಾನ ಸಮಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಮಗೆ. ಯಾವ ಹೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ಮೃತ್ಯು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಆವರಿಸ್ತದೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಈ ಜನ್ಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಭಗವಂತ ನಮಗೆ ಬೇಕಾದಂತಹ ಎಲ್ಲ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಗಳನ್ನು ಒದಗಿಸಿಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾನೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಸೆಕೆಂಡು ನಾವು ವ್ಯರ್ಥ ಮಾಡುವಂತಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಭಗವಂತನ ಪಾದದಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಥಿರವಾದ ರಕ್ಷಣೆ ಪಡೆದು ಆನಂದಮಯ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವ ಅಂಥೇಳಿ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಭಗವಂತನ ಶ್ರೇಯಸ್ಸನ್ನು ಕೋರುತ್ತಾ ಶ್ರೀಕೃಷ್ಣಾರ್ಪಣಮಸ್ತು.